It may have been the greatest army of all time, conquering and controlling an empire that stretched right across the ancient world. It was ruthless, disciplined, and feared by all, not just by its enemies who died in their millions, but by its own emperors, who often paid the price of the army's wrath. And yet, these soldiers were builders as well as destroyers, helping to spread a culture that became the bedrock of Western civilization. What was it that made this army so dominant? How was it able to rule and reshape the classical world? And why did it eventually fall? This is the story of the Roman war machine. By the 2nd century AD, Rome's empire had expanded about as far as it could. Now it was time for consolidation. The Roman army, instead of plundering and butchering new territories, turned around and did the opposite. It started building them up. Where they had destroyed, the legions created. Because the army was the first Roman presence in a new land, the soldiers had to be able to build their own forts and defenses. And so, each legion had its own architects, surveyors, and engineers. The soldiers themselves provided the ready manpower, and some of their work has lasted 2,000 years.
We tend to be very arrogant in the late 20th century and think that we have invented wonderful methods of building, but we shouldn't underestimate the Romans as engineers. They're great as soldiers, but they are supreme as engineers.
With that engineering skill, soldiers were sometimes put to work on civilian projects during the long periods of peace after Roman conquest. It was a way of setting Rome's stamp on conquered lands. The most straightforward and the most obvious of the army building projects were the roads. They enabled the legions to move rapidly to any trouble spot and also allowed trade to flourish. 53,000 miles of roads were built to connect the empire. All roads really did lead to Rome. Some building projects were breathtaking. For example, the Pont du Gard in southern France. It's one of the highest bridges in the Roman world, standing 160 feet high, and was part of an aqueduct that carried water to the city of Nîmes. The engineering is precise. The aqueduct slopes so gently that over its 30-mile journey, it falls just 30 feet from start to finish. The bridge was built around 50 AD. By then, the Romans already knew how to build something this big without even using mortar.
The lower part of the bridge is built with these big stone blocks. Some of them weigh 6 tons, which is really impressive. And in this case, I mean, if you use big stone blocks like that, you don't necessarily need mortar, because if the stones are perfectly cut, they're heavy enough. And we know that they floated the stones up on rafts towards the bridge itself, and then afterwards they could raise the stones. They had all sorts of systems, such as winches, pulleys, and hoists, and so on.
Unlike the great buildings in Rome itself, which were carefully documented, we don't know exactly who built works like this in the provinces, because no records were kept. But it's possible the army had at least some role in the Pont du Gard.
We have absolutely no proof that the army did help, but it is a theory, of course, because we know that they needed the know-how, the organization, the labor, and so on and so forth.
The aqueduct's water flowed through a covered channel that ran along the top of the bridge. Using gravity, it delivered 20,000 tons of water a day to the city of Nîmes.
What you can see here is, first of all, the size of it. It's about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, which is really pretty considerable. And it supplied a city of some 30,000 inhabitants with all the water they needed, actually.
Apart from the obvious benefits such works brought to the empire, Using the soldiers as builders had other payoffs. First, it let the emperors sleep a little better at night, because an army that's busy at work has less time to plan political overthrows.
The modern army has a great program of tank washing and tank maintenance just to keep the troops occupied. The Roman army solved that problem of keeping your troops occupied by turning them into builders.
Building was one of the least favorite activities for soldiers, especially the heavy work of stone cutting. And there were even mutinies by units who felt they were being overworked. Every common soldier's dream was to get out of this kind of work by being designated as immunis, literally a soldier immune from the worst jobs because of his skills. Those with immune status included blacksmiths, surveyors, medics, arrowsmiths, trumpet makers, and keepers of sacrificial animals. Another payoff from using soldiers as builders was that it helped to keep conquered people passive by giving them the advantages of Roman civilization.
They could then be brought within the Roman world and given the benefits of Roman civilization, of Roman urban life, of food, social organization, bathing. The spread of hot water and bathing is an important part of the Roman takeover of northwestern Europe.
A fine example of the good life that Rome brought to its conquered citizens is the amphitheatre at the military colony of Nîmes in southern France. Built in the 1st century AD, it holds 20,000 people and is still used for concerts and bullfights. 2,000 years ago, it was used for animal hunts and military demonstrations. Through gladiatorial contests, the Romans were able to perpetuate the notion among conquered people of the superiority of the Roman warrior. The amphitheatre was also a place where the people of the conquered provinces could see the majesty of the empire, literally.
We are quite sure that we had the emperor and very important magistrate of Roman Empire coming to Nîmes. So it was, in a way, television for the people here to see these personalities, and in a way they could feel part, sitting here, a part of this empire, to keep the people quiet and satisfied, we may say.
Roman building in the provinces also helped to indoctrinate local people with the godlike qualities of the emperors. One example is the theatre at the military colony of Orange in France. Also built well enough still to be used today, it has a wall 120 feet high behind the stage, equal to a 10-story building. Not only would the size and sweep have impressed local inhabitants, but punctuating the wall is a statue of the Emperor Augustus looking down on them as if from the heavens.
The back wall of this theatre is one of a very impressive Roman building as it is now. But it used to be much more impressive with the marble covering, the 3 floors, and on the top of the scene was the statue of the Emperor himself, looking at the spectators as a god.
But it wasn't just with architecture that the Roman army spread civilization through the empire. We'll see that the thirsty legions also helped to start the European wine industry. Whenever one raises a glass of French or German wine, there's an unconscious toast to the Roman army, because it was the soldiers who first planted the vines in many of the great wine-growing regions of Europe. As they conquered new territories, the vine went with them.
The Romans did bring vines to France, and the Roman army was part of that process, as they were instrumental in bringing other crops and other aspects of Roman culture into Western Europe.
It's not surprising the army planted vines, because each Roman soldier was given an allowance of 2 pints of wine a day.
It's quite true that the Romans couldn't live without wines. It was part of their culture. It was part of their civilization. And being abroad, if I may say so, they came over here. The very first thing they wanted to do is to make sure that they could get their favorite elixir over here. as it was certainly quite a problem to bring it in those old potteries.
Before the Roman invasion, wine in France was so rare and so prized that the natives of France, the Gauls, paid Italian merchants the price of one slave for one large container, an amphora of wine. Until the Romans, winemaking in France was probably restricted to the area around the Greek colony of Marseille in the south. As Rome began to conquer France, soldiers and civilians began planting vines as they went, including the Rhone Valley, Burgundy, the Loire Valley, and Champagne, and also the Rhine and Moselle valleys in Germany. In the Champagne district of northern France, Roman occupation may have helped the champagne industry accidentally in a different way. Below the surface of the Champagne region, about 75 feet underground, there are more than 100 miles of cellars dug from the chalk. It's believed that some of these cellars may have begun as quarries in the 1st or 2nd century AD to provide chalk for building blocks. Today, these underground chalk quarries serve as cellars for Champagne's 800 million bottles. Towards the end of the empire, it's believed these cellars may have been important to Romanized citizens, but for a very different reason. They were a possible refuge from raids by invading German tribes who envied the comforts of Roman life, including wine.
There's no doubt that barbarians wanted to share in Roman luxuries. There are plenty of Roman luxuries that you find in Germanic barbarian areas even before the invasions take place. They like to get hold of them through trade or gift or whatever.
The cellars have also been used as a refuge in more modern times. During both World Wars, there was fierce fighting in the Champagne district, and civilians used the cellars for temporary safety.
When the bombing started, people were very soon coming here in the cellars, and we have found a lot of furniture here, some forks and knives and bottles and plates, everything, and we think that they were just living here for a couple of days, perhaps, just waiting for the end of the bombing.
Even today, European defense chiefs apparently have their eye on using the Roman cellars again, if necessary.
I've been showing around cellars, a senior officer from NATO, and after the visit with a twinkle in the eye, he said, "Christian, it's certainly the place I like to spend the Third World War conflict."
Although the army helped spread civilization as a way of keeping the peace in the conquered provinces, it was never afraid to use the stick as well as the carrot if the provincials got out of line.
What should never be forgotten is that this peace was actually maintained by the threat of armed force. And within those lands, society as a whole was still pretty violent. It was still a slave-owning society. People were very frequently physically brutalized.
Rome spread its distinct form of civilization throughout its empire. And yet, the process carried within it the seeds of the empire's destruction. The civilized empire became a magnet to barbarian tribes living outside the empire who wanted a share of the Roman lifestyle. Rome almost flaunted its wealth at the barbarians by having many of its forts and colonies right on the borders of the empire in full view of the barbarians.
The soldiers are the only sector of society who have pay, and their pay is being spent in that area. So you get these cities like Cologne and Mainz and Budapest, Vienna and so forth growing up in what had previously been very barren areas, and right across on the other side of the river, so to speak, are these unfortunate people who have nothing. And this makes a magnet for them. Wonderful network of roads. So the barbarians who invade, they go across the river, and there's a milestone saying, you know, Rome 600 miles this way. I mean, yeah, that things are made so much easier as well as more attractive for them.
One of the first major signs of trouble came in the 170s AD, when Germanic tribes invaded Italy. They said they were forced to invade because of turf wars with other barbarian tribes.
Roman writers comment, among the bodies of the dead there were women and children, and the tribe said, look, please take us into the empire. we are being put under terrible pressure by the tribes from the interior, and we want land. Some of them were accepted to start with, but then